Hi, welcome to week 5 of U.S. history since 1865, and today we conclude the Gilded Age by talking about the Progressive Era and the progressive movements. So Foner describes the progressive movements as a broad, loosely defined political movement of individuals and groups who hope to bring about significant change in American social and political life. And he says that it sprang up in the 1890s. And the progressive movement, I think it really brings an end to the Gilded Age. It led to some profound changes in American society. In particular, it expanded women's suffrage, so women won the right to vote. It expanded workers' rights and government regulation of the workplace. And it also weakened corruption. However, there was an unsavory side of the progressive era, and that was that it promoted eugenics. It also promoted this kind of uncritical idea of what it meant to be American and Americanization, and limited democracy. So that's such a weird contradiction, that this movement that was profoundly democratic, it's about citizen engagement, espoused some policies that actually limited citizen engagement. In fact, this is a period of contradictions. There's this desire to help, there's this desire to make the world better, but it's rooted in very condescending ideas about the nature of ethnicities and class, etc. So even given those weird contradictions, we really can't forget, and I really want to underscore, that this is a period of democracy in action. This is a period when people, stirred by problems they saw in their society around them, said, hey, this isn't okay with me, and I'm going to do something about it. And they did. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why this sudden outpouring of activism? Why at that moment? What led people to want to take action? And that's what we're going to talk about very briefly today, and what you'll read about in the readings for today. So let's answer that first question. Why then? So the Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution had led people to ask questions about the nature of individuals and their relationship to society. What should that relationship be? What are the proper roles of men and women, families, etc.? Is there a relationship between pleasure and work? So during this period, the social relations were changing. The wealthy had really glorified individualism, right? The pursuit of individual wealth and leisure and pleasure, etc. At the same time that they're pursuing their individual happiness, the working class is struggling with profound poverty, with profound hardship. Many of it can be traced to the wealthy's desire to have this profound wealth, right? And then there were the farmers who were working really hard and barely making it. And into this conversation about the nature of the individual and its relationship to society entered the middle class. So the middle class had also been taught to idealize individualism and self-discipline, but they saw the wealth of the upper class and the hardship that other people were facing, farmers and workers, and they couldn't reconcile it with what was going on. They couldn't get used to the class conflict that they were suddenly beginning to see all around them, and they couldn't get used to the human toll that was caused by this profoundly individualist spirit that had taken root. Who is the middle class? So the middle class are small business owners, they're professionals, they're also clerks and salespeople, managers, bureaucrats, and their numbers are growing in the Gilded Age. By the 1890s and early 1900s, by the turn of the century really, 1 in 5 people in the US were members of the middle class. Their life was comfortable, but it was marked by limits, and it was threatened by the economic power of the wealthy. It was also threatened by the sort of very different culture of the wealthy and the very different culture of the working class. And it was threatened by what they perceived to be the conflict between the working class and the wealthy. And they wanted to do something about it. Activism in the progressive era became a way of dealing with the insecurity they saw all around them. And it was motivated by a real desire to help other people. They wanted to make the world safe for themselves and for their children. But to do that, they wanted to turn basically the working class and the poor into their image. They wanted them to embrace middle class culture and middle class values. And you'll see what the consequences of that are in the textbook. So, key to inspiring the middle class to take action were muckrakers. So, muckrakers were a new generation of journalists who were writing for national magazines, that is, magazines that had a national audience. And they were focused on exposing the underside of the Gilded Age of industrial and urban life. They were focused on rooting out corruption, writing stories about corruption, stories about brutal working conditions and inequality. One of the most famous ones is Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book, The Jungle, which is an expose of the terrible conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants. Once muckrakers would write these stories about corruption or mistreatment of workers, etc., reformers then picked it up. Reformers were activists who were working for political change. They specifically, what they wanted in the progressive era was a really active federal government to pass social legislation that would limit insecurity and that would address the problems of the Gilded Age. And so this is really different. They are fighting against the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, and they're fighting against the idea of liberty of contract, which both of those tenets basically said the government should stay out of regulating the workplace, etc., housing conditions. They're inspired by European movements that have won pensions and minimum wage laws and unemployment insurance. And they're motivated by this idea that freedom actually requires the government to act on behalf of those with very little wealth or very little power. But it's also about association. It's about creating links between people, alliances. And women were a key part of the progressive movement. More and more women were working outside of the home, especially working class and immigrant women, and work had become a symbol of emancipation. And you're going to see this a little bit in the documentary this week. This is when feminism became used for the first time to refer to women's personal freedom and emancipation. And this is when the women's suffrage movement really begins to pick up steam, the fight for women's right to vote. At the same time, women are also fighting for reproductive rights, the right to control how many children they're going to have. And you'll read all about those movements in the textbook. What about workers? So workers were also really active in this period. So we associate the progressive era a lot with middle-class reformers, but workers were really active in this era. This is a period when socialism peaked. In 1901, the Socialist Party platform here in the US was fighting for free college, labor regulations. They wanted the state, the federal government, to own factories and railroads and to run them. They believed, socialists believed, the government should manage the economy. It should control the major means of production. And lots of people actually agreed. 6% of the electorate, 6% of voters in 1912 voted for the socialist candidate. And one of the reasons why is because many workers were espousing socialism. They were espousing socialism because they faced terrible working conditions. These terrible working conditions were the result of that idea of liberty of contract and laissez-faire capitalism. One of the unions that was particularly strong in advocating for workers' rights was the International Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies. They promoted solidarity among all workers, and their dream was to create one big union that would encompass and be welcome to everybody: immigrants, migrants, women, African Americans, Chinese Americans, etc. It was really the most radical union of the early 20th century. They believed that capitalism was inherently flawed and that it needed to be changed. And this is really different. This is very radical for this moment because not even the progressives were saying that. Progressives believed that capitalism was generally a good thing, it just needed to be fixed. But the Wobblies said, nope, capitalism is the problem. And as a result of this belief, they faced profound repression. And you'll read about that in Eric Foner's textbook. How did the government respond to these movements? Well, progressive politicians were pretty receptive to the progressive movements, pretty progressive to embracing reform because they were afraid of socialism and they were afraid of more what they viewed as more radical demands. So progressives in the national government began to see the government as a positive good, that the government could enforce provisions of the Constitution, that the government could promote regulation of the workplace, and that it could soften capitalism, that it could maintain the health of the economy while also taking care of its citizens. So the progressive era really espoused this like kinder, gentler, softer version of capitalism. The other interesting thing about the government response in this movement is that this is a time when popular government was invigorated. Women, like I said, won the right to vote in 1919. The 17th Amendment was passed, in which the senators would now be elected by the popular vote. Laws were passed that also allowed for citizen initiatives and referendums and recalls. So it's a moment when citizens are being encouraged to participate in the government. And there's this new idea about the state, that the state should protect and advance freedom, that the government should feel empowered and be empowered in order to protect its citizens. At the same time, though, there's this weird flip side, which is a growing anti-democratic tendency that we'll see in the rise of the city manager system, and you'll read about that in the textbook. Okay, so that's just a very quick summary of some key aspects of the progressive era.